Hi, I'm FIDE Master Levi Cherbulenko, and in this series I explore the typical mistakes of people rated anywhere between 1000 and 2000. This is a first reaction, no engine analysis, of a chess.com gameplay between 1860 versus 1799. Let's start. Okay, so I'd play c for the English opening. e5, yeah, a classical response, but I can also play like c5, mirror white is also possible. But let's see, e5, knight c3, white develops. There is this common idea that you put the knight behind the pawn, especially the queenside knights. Like the kingside knight you can put in front of the pawn, right? Because you want to castle kingside most of the time, and you don't want to move this pawn, not to weaken your kingside, right? Not to weaken your king, the long dark diagonal. But with a queenside knight, there's no such risk. So usually you want to first push the c-pawn and then put the knight behind. Why? Because if you play, let's say, like this, right? Well, let's say some random move, whatever, and then black can go d5, and then you lose the control of the center, right? You cannot take with a knight on d5, and so black controls the center, and then black can like push further and make your pieces go backwards. That's why you first play c4, and after e5, knight c3, now already you have not only a knight but also a pawn to defend d5, and now if you play d5 it will just take, right? And even if black plays like, let's say, knight f6 and then d5, you take and he takes. Yes, he takes back, but he takes back with a piece. And the knight on d5, let's say, I'll make some random move. The knight on d5 does not have the power, you know, to like push forward and like make your pieces go backward like a pawn would do, right? The knight is the same value as this knight, and so you're not obliged to like move your knight away, okay? So that's why usually pawns in the center are better than pieces in the center. Pawns first, pieces then, pieces later, okay? But let's see. So knight c3, knight f6, actually black did play knight f6, alright, d3, opening up the bishop, maybe potentially might pin the knight. This is not the main move. I would actually recommend here knight f3, putting pressure on the pawn, and then if knight c6, the main move most people play like g3. That's like the most typical in the English, fianchettoing the bishop and then putting pressure on the long diagonal. Usually white castles short, and then goes rook b1, b4, b5, putting pressure on the diagonal. The knight will move somewhere, and then the bishop will put pressure on b7, right? And black usually tries to like construct a barrier with like c6, d5, right, to make a barrier against our bishop. And by playing b5, we actually put pressure on that c6 pawn, so we kind of destroy that barrier to make our bishop, you know, have a larger scope. Yeah. So, but here I'd recommend actually e3, not g3, but e3. This is like more flexible, more like neo English. And the point is, depending on the situation, we can either play d4, and after takes we can like take with a pawn, for example, and fight for the center. Other times we can even take with a knight, and then let's say we take, and then we take with a queen, and then we have an active queen that puts pressure on the black's position. And another idea might also be to play something like queen c2, perhaps fianchetto our bishop, play b3, bishop b2, and then eventually there's this idea of bishop d3, pressuring h7 and g7. Basically you get two neighboring bishops, right? You have the b2 bishop that points toward g7, and the d3 bishop that points toward h7. So you have two neighboring fianchettoing bishops, maybe not fianchettoing, b2's fianchettoing, but d3 also looks like a fianchetto one, right? Put pressure on h7. So this is, and you can also by the way castle long. And then there's also this idea of rook g1, g4, g5. So this is a very different kind of neo-English way we attack, go for the attack. But anyway, white play d3. d3 is also fine, just normal development. c6. So yes, black wanna go for d5. So that would be another plus of knight f3. We basically oblige black to play knight c6, and now already black cannot play c6, d5. Okay. But okay, d3, c6, alright. Bishop g5, pinning the knight so that black cannot play d5. Alright. I mean, another move would be, probably a better move would be actually knight f3. We first develop the knight, then the bishops. The knights and the bishops. And this actually, although maybe black can still play d5, because I was thinking this obliges black to play d6. And then if you want, you can play bishop g5 or, oops. Or actually bishop g5 maybe not the best. Because like black can just play like h6, let's say bishop h4 and bishop e7, and there's no more real pin, and this bishop is kind of stuck. There's no more pin. If you go to g3, it will be stuck against d6, e5. So like not the best diagonal, I think. I think it's better to keep it here, where it has a longer diagonal and potentially can put pressure on the king side. You know, if black ever plays h6, maybe like some sacrifice eventually, who knows. Or maybe it can go through d2 or through e3, attack on the king side, right? Better than h4. But I was thinking maybe black can play d5 here nonetheless. Because then if you, let's say, just take the pawn, then black just goes d4, attacking the knight moves somewhere, let's say knight b1, and then there's queen a5 check, actually a double attack, and we lose the knight. Or for example, if we take again d4, if you simply move the knight back, then again queen a5 check, double attack, and black wins the knight. Now there is a solution potentially. We could play takes, let me see, takes d4, and now there's this check. But so we give a check and we prevent queen a5, right? And now like basically black has to like defend somehow, put some knight on d7, let's say, and now you can just, I don't know, or actually wait a bit, just queen d4 wins. We win the second pawn and also defend the knight. So actually, how does black play? But even if we couldn't play queen d4, at the very least we could just like move our knight back already, yeah? And now there's no more queen a5 check. So at the very least there's no queen a5 check, but also we actually might maybe end up taking this second pawn and with a big advantage, yeah. So maybe d5 actually does not work. So when yeah, knight f3 I like, and after d6 a move like, let's say, g3, and like I said, I keep my bishop on c1 because later on it may go through better diagonals. And maybe like next thing, getting the bishop, castle short, oops, and then rook b1, b5, b4, b5, putting pressure on c6. If I can get rid of c6, then my bishop will have a larger scope, put pressure on b7 together with my rook on b1. But also if I can get rid of a c6 pawn, d5 will become very weak, and then black will not be able to play d5. See, if c6 is strong, black can play d5, dominating the center. If I get rid of c6, if I make him take, yeah, on b5 say, then not only black will not be able to play d5, but actually I will be able to install my minor pieces on d5, right? Okay, but nonetheless, let's see. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, bishop e7. I think more precise, usually in these kind of positions, is first make him determine on which diagonal he wanna go. Let's say bishop h4 and then bishop e7, you know. But okay, bishop e7 is fine, knight f3, d6, g3, okay. h6, yeah, see now actually white cannot even play bishop h4, you know, because of g3 and getting the bishop, because the bishop will be trapped. So like I said, basically white simply wasted a tempo, and now we need to go back. Wait, bishop f6. Yeah, this is kind of double-edged. I mean, I see a point. The point would be that the knight on f6 guards the key e4 and d5 squares, especially d5, and so it will help with d5. And so if we get rid of this knight, right, and then play bishop g2, and then a move, let's say, like knight d2, then we will control the d5 square and make, like, for black more difficult to push d5, and then we can go, like I said earlier, for b5, before b5, but it's double-edged, because on the other hand, the position is not like it's super close, and now black has the power of 3 bishops, and so eventually if it opens up, I mean, this bishop might be quite strong. We also have like potentially weak dark squares like d4, like this long diagonal, so we need to be careful with b4, because potentially there's this tactic with e4, right? I mean, pressure on this long diagonal on the c3 knight on the a1 rook. So I don't know, I mean, black can play like bishop e7 and then like either, like I said, bishop e6 and like d5 potentially, or bishop e7 and then f5, or I don't know, f4 or e4. So basically there are a lot of pawn breaks. And so if there are a lot of pawn breaks, the position can open up, and then the two bishops can become very strong, especially this bishop, the f6 bishop, because it has no counterpart. And we have all our pawns of light squares, basically, essential pawns, and so the dark pawns, the dark squares and diagonals might potentially be weak. So it's kind of double-edged. Like, this would have made a lot of sense, you know when? It would have made a lot of sense if, let's say, this pawn was here. Because with this pawn here, there is no, like, then d5 is really super weak, right? And then there's no potential pawn break, you know, then the position would be more fixed. more inflexible. And when it's more fixed and inflexible, that's when knights are especially better than bishop. But here the position still holds potential. There is still flexibility and potential for a pawn break. So that's why it's kind of double-edged. I'm not so sure about this. I'm not so sure about this. Probably not so great. This is probably not very great for white. But like I said, there are also pluses, of course, because now it will be more difficult for black to play d5, and so this, of course, is an advantage. So it's not all just bad. There are also some advantages. But okay, let's see, bishop e6. Okay, white castles make sense. Black goes straight forward for d5. Actually, I'm not so sure about this. I am not so sure. Usually, it's not a good idea to, push in the center while your king is in the center still. Like, you don't want to make a pawn break in the center with the king still vulnerable in the center. So I think way safer for black would have been to simply castle, and then already depending on the situation, black can either go for d5, or like I said earlier, black can play bishop e7 and then f5, and then depending on the situation, either try to go for some e4 stuff, or like d5 e4, right? Basically f5 d5 e4, or simply f5 e4, or go for f5 f4 and attack on the king side, right? Maybe like play, let's say, f5 f4 and then like queen d7, say, or queen c8, and then bishop h3, and trade this bishop, which one guards white's weak light squares, guards the king, and also potentially puts pressure on the weak diagonal, on the, not weak, but on the long diagonal. And so f5 f4, queen c8, bishop h3 would be also an interesting idea. Another idea would be to simply not rush and to simply develop a knight first, maybe, right? Because the rooks are still disconnected, knight undeveloped, so this would be also an idea to like just develop a knight, just put it on d7, and then maybe put it, I don't know, maybe on c5 or something, maybe solidify with a5, or just keep it on d7 for now and then figure out a way to put it, or maybe to play knight d7, bishop e7, f5, and then the knight to put it on f6, where it will be closer to the king side. This would also be a plan, by the way. So black would play knight d7, bishop e7, f5, knight f6, and then black would play, by the way, black would play queen e8, queen h5, typical idea, and then f4, and then bishop h3, and then knight g4. For example, let me demonstrate. Let's say, I'll just pass the move to make it simple. Something like this. F4, bishop h3, and knight g4. And now black has a huge attack. h2 is very weak. Next, black threatens basically to take here, take the knight, and then checkmate on h2, right? Because he has pressure on h2 with the knight and the queen. So this is a typical English attack for black, usually, right? So that would be also a way, right, to bring the knight to the king side, then, like I said, with f4 and bishop h3. So there are multiple plans, but like to rush, I don't see why is this the number one priority right now. To play immediately, there's no rush. There's no rush. So that's why remember this lesson, don't rush with pawn breaks in the center with the king in the center. First develop all your pieces, minor, heavy, all this stuff, and then you can push in the center. Okay, so this is I think a bit too premature. But all right, let's see. Takes makes sense because white fixes this weakness. Now this is a pawn that's not defended by another pawn, right? So white fixes the weakness. Also, if white does not take, eventually maybe black takes or plays d4, and then this pawn on c6 still guards the d5 square, and also still creates this barrier against the bishop, right? There's still this b7 c6 pawn against the bishop, versus if we take, now already there's no more c6 pawn, and so the barrier is weaker, and now there is the b7 pawn only. Okay, so in these kind of positions, makes sense to take. All right. Okay, d4. Now d4 is quite interesting. Again, fixing the d5 pawn, making sure that black cannot like play d4 maybe eventually, right? So we want to fix it and then win it, right? And also ideally, of course, we want black to take, and then we take with a knight, and then black has an isolated pawn. So it makes sense, but let's see if there's anything else. Now I'm curious if queen b3 potentially might be interesting, pressuring here, and the point is that if d4, then queen b7. And so black cannot take the knight because we take the rook, and so then we win the game. Maybe black can play here like knight b7, but then I think we can just play knight e4, and I don't think black has enough compensation. I think black should, and then if rook b8, we also get queen a7 as well. So I think white should be fine here. Maybe black can play like queen d7. But then there's knight d2. There's this move knight d2 opening up the bishop, and again putting pressure on d5, b7. And again, if here, although let's see, queen b7, say takes, takes. But now we don't need to take the rook. It's not going anywhere, so we can just take here. And then we just, let's say we place whatever move, let's say castles, and then we take. And we have what? I think we're up an exchange, yeah. So white should be completely winning. So remember this idea as well, by the way, very typical idea. You play knight d2 to open up your bishop, put pressure on the diagonal. So probably objectively, black maybe has some better defenses. I don't know, maybe like, yeah, actually not so clear. I was thinking this takes 95 members, check, there's no check. If with a queen, then we take the knight. If we have a bishop we defend, then we have queen takes d5. Actually, it's not so simple. Or I was thinking maybe black can just like ignore takes and then knight bd7. But again, we get like knight d5, and then if rook b8, we can take with check on f6, and then like queen a7. Actually, it's not so easy to defend. It's not so easy. So that's why I think queen b3 would have been pretty interesting. Yeah, maybe the best. Yeah, could have been the best maybe. And queen b6 doesn't work. We just take. And then if takes, and then if takes here, we just take here, and this should be a big advantage, because when we take on b2, we have like rook b1, and then take on b7 with huge advantage. And if queen takes here, then we have knight f6 takes, and then if bishop takes b3, we get knight d2, attacking the bishop, and after bishop, let's say e6, bishop b7, and we win the rook. Okay, so again, you see all the problems black has with this move d5 being underdeveloped and playing in the center too soon. Okay, but again, white played d4, so that's why I can conclude that I think queen b3 was the best practical choice. Right, so the lesson here is that always make the most aggressive move possible, because the problem with d4, it looks aggressive, but black can just play e4, and then we have to like waste time. So like strategically it makes sense maybe, but it's not the most dynamic, the most aggressive. Also like it blocks this diagonal, and so this bishop will be blocked. So it's not the most tactical. First, always look at the moves that like the most tactically aggressive, right? Moves that don't block your pieces. And then already secondly, you can think about strategical approach, playing d4, fixing this pawn, and all this stuff, right? First, tactics, then strategy, okay? All right, let's see, d4, e4, knight e5, yeah, I mean knight d2. Well, actually knight d2, yeah, knight d2, bishop d4, right? I mean, if queen a4 check, there is knight c6. Okay, yeah, knight e5. Yeah, looks kind of weird a bit, yeah. Kind of loose, but I guess it's fine. Knight 2 c6, alright. Knight takes c6. I mean, queen a4 would have been interesting, pinning the knight. Right, you can always take it, why not pin it, and then maybe like rook c1, and then like eventually take it. There's no rush. The flight is stronger than the execution. So, yeah, I think it's better to just like simply pin it. But okay, knight c6. Alright, now this pawn is weak, right? The downside is now black has strengthened his center. Black has the two bishops, also the b file potentially, pressure against b2, potentially black can play like c5, open up game, this diagonal will open, and then if he gets rid of a d4 pawn, right, let's say we take, he can maybe potentially play d4, although this is all not so simple because we take on e4, so black would need to play something like bishop e7, f5, strengthen e4, and then maybe go for c5, or he can keep it on c6 and then go for actually f5, f4, try to attack on the king side, right, f5, f4, and then either e3 or fg or f3 already, it will depend on the situation. The point is, black has a very strong pawn center. The downside is the c6 pawn is weak, and also the c5 square is weak. So we can put pressure on c6, and also eventually we can maybe put our knight on c5, a great outpost where it cannot be attacked by a pawn. So as you see, in chess it's not always like black and white. There are pluses and minuses, good factors, bad factors, right? And it will depend how you will, play with those factors, right? That will determine the fate of your game. Okay, so e3 makes sense. Defending this pawn makes sense. Queen a5. Of course, white could have played like queen a4 first to prevent queen a5. Also, that made a lot of sense, right? Put pressure, defend the pawn, connect the rooks, and then white can play e3. The downside of this though is that then white cannot play knight a5, knight e4, knight c5, and so the knight on c3 is quite stuck, doesn't have too many moves. So the only square basically that's good would be like, I don't know, c5 or potentially a5, right, to pressure c6 from a5, or maybe f4 to pressure the bishop, but again, the bishop can just move and then like black can just play like g5, so f4 is not super stable. So yeah, c3 is not the best square. That would be the downside of queen a4. But okay, let's see, e3, queen a5, all right. Knight a4. See, like I said. Okay. Bishop e7, black is trying to prevent knight c5, yeah. But I mean, yeah, rook c1 makes sense, pressuring the pawn. Rook c8, all right. a3. So I guess white wanna play b4, attack the queen, and also fix the c5 square. Yeah, I mean, this makes a lot of sense. There's only one downside, which I think maybe white did not keep in mind. The problem is that we need to think prophylactically, not just one move ahead, but a couple of moves ahead. Always try to be a couple of moves ahead of your opponent. The problem with this approach is that then we give black a potential for pawn break. So basically black will like move back the queen, and then black can play a5 with pawn break, creating weaknesses. And then like, if we do nothing, then we take on b4, we take, and then the b4 pawn will be a potentially weakness, a potentially weak pawn, a weakness. Or if we take on a5, then we take on a5, and then the a pawn, yes, it might be potentially a passed pawn, might be an asset, but also it might be a weakness, if, you know, depending on the situation. So that's the only downside, is that usually when we dominate, we don't want to give black or our opponent the chance to create a pawn break, because again, usually that will challenge our pawn structure, and then a lot of times it's not an asset, but a lot of times actually it becomes a weakness, it becomes an isolated pawn, right? Like I said, if we take on b4, we take back, it's isolated, or if we take on a5, it's still isolated. So chances are we'll not be able to push that pawn. Or other times it might become an asset, it depends, but a lot of times it doesn't. That's why usually in these kind of positions, and by the way, black would like put later on pressure on the pawn and stuff, right? They like try to maybe double the rooks and stuff. So usually the rule of thumb, in these kind of positions, we play, not necessarily right now, but eventually we play b3, because like I said, black will like play rook b8 and stuff, and so we play b3. b3 stops the pressure on the b file, but also does not give black the chance of a pawn break, because they cannot play a5, a4, because we control with a knight the a4 square, basically, and also the queen, and we have too many defenders of the a5 square, a4 square, so they cannot play a5, a4 so easily as they can play after a3, b4, as they can play a5. Also, by the way, after a5, and let's say if they take, we take, the bishop will attack b4, right? After ab, it will be attacked by the bishop. Or if we take on a5, they take on a5, the bishop will attack a3, correct? But if we play b3 and say they somehow manage to play a4, well, we can take on a4 and the bishop does not attack a4. Or if they take on b3 and we take on b3, again, the bishop will not attack b3. So you can see the difference. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead. a3. Yeah, I think maybe like, yeah, white could have just played like b3, like I said, yeah, just b3. And then, by the way, a good idea in this kind of positions is to exchange the queens, because like this queen is quite active, can create problems and stuff, and so we just want to exchange the queens, and then we can like double up with rooks on the c file, put pressure on c6, perhaps, you know, remaneuver our bishop, annoy the rook, maybe knight c5. Also, like without the queens, we're not that afraid of this attack on the king side potentially, because without the queens there is no real threat of a checkmate. And also there's like more stress on the long-term strategical weakness of black's weakness on c5 and c6. So with the queens, more stress on tactics, counterplay, attack. Without queens, more stress on long-term weaknesses, which black here has the long-term weakness of a pawn and c5 square. Because without queens on the board, it's more difficult to generate tactics, counterplay. That's why we want to eliminate the queens. And so, by the way, the plus of b3 would be, it also would defend the knight and then actually enable us to play queen e1, because you cannot play queen e1 immediately because you lose the knight. Okay, so b3 I think would have been quite multi-purpose. But okay, white chose a3. c5, huh? Okay, now this already does not look good for black. I think black should have just like castled, and after b4 just play like queen somewhere. I don't know, even back, and then like go for a5 basically, like I said, exploit white's advancement over pawns. Yeah. And also with the queens over board, there's also this potential of like f4 and maybe like f3 eventually, maybe. Or like I said, just focus on the queen side with a5. But yeah, c5 looks kind of risky. It's the same. We'll see if it's actually so bad for black or not, but already intuitively does not look great. It's in the same nature as like when black played d5 earlier, if you remember, right? In the opening, black played d5 with the king still in the center. And we said that's not a good idea. It's basically in the same style here. Black's king is still in the center, but they already play c5, opening up the game with the king in the center. Usually that does not end well. But let's see. D... Knight c5. Well, I mean, wait a bit. What about dc? Actually, dc looks great, because when bishop c5, we just play like b4. It's completely winning, double attack. It's actually elementary. No? Unless, actually, wait, I see an idea, maybe it's not so simple. But basically, bishop c5, b4, of course, is completely winning. But maybe black's idea was to play bishop d7, attack the knight. But even this looks horrible. Even this looks bad, because now, let me see. I mean, even like just like, let's say, even like knight c3, and then pressuring d5, and now this is a super weak pawn without the support of a c6 pawn. It's a super weak pawn. And how do they play, by the way? So we're threatening to take the pawn. If they take, let's say, with a rook, seemingly guarding the pawn, well, guess what? We just play, we just play b4, right? Let's promote. We just play b4, double attack, game over. If they take with bishop, is the same stuff, right? And if they do nothing, we just take on d5 next. It's completely winning, right? It's absolutely winning. So and also we might eventually maybe somehow reinforce the pawn, and we need to calculate that natural a3 pawn. But you get the point. d5 is super weak, and white has a huge. So I don't understand. Why not just go dc? Also, like eventually you can like maybe put pressure here, activate the queen. Just need to be careful about bishop f6. And basically the next move is b4 actually. So bishop d7 is bad for black, and if not bishop d7, we just play b4 next. Attack the queen, make it go away, and also guard this pawn, and then the knight can go back, attack the d5 pawn. So white has a huge advantage. Yeah, so actually c5c, even intuitively I knew it's wrong, and then I actually proved it by precise calculation. That's how it happens a lot of times. You first intuitively, you apply the principles intuitively, right? Just apply the common principles, and then a lot of times they just work. Don't play in the center. Don't like make pawn breaks in the center with a king in the center. It's an intuitive principle, a common principle, and a lot of times it simply will work or not work for your opponent. Okay, so strategy, principles, and calculation and tactics go hand in hand, as you can see. All right, let's see. So c5, yeah, knight c5, big mistake, big opportunity cost. Should have played like this. Should play dc with big advantage. But okay, let's see. It takes. Rook takes. Yeah, I mean, even here, actually, dc I think would have been more interesting. And after this, yeah, I mean, of course, we can just like transpose this and take. It is still good for white. There's also queen d4, looks not bad, attacking the rook, but also attacking on g7 also looks not bad. Also, there's like this b4 move, say takes and then take, attacking the queen, and then we can maybe give some checks, or queen c3 pressuring here, or queen c5 pressuring a7. It also guards the pawn. This also looks good. Or like I said, queen d4 also looks good. Or even just take and then I guess transpose through the game also is fine. But still, I want to have more options. With dc, I think I have more options. The only point of rook c5 would be here maybe that you can play like b4, and after this go like this. But I don't know if this is actually better than dc. I'm not so sure, because now black has this pawn. Not so sure. Although this pawn on c5 is also pretty strong. White has a very neat pawn structure. So yeah, but there is at least a small risk, versus if you play with like dc, there is basically zero risk. But again, like I said, this also has a plus, because we have a great pawn structure and a defended defended pass pawn, so also looks not bad. But I think dc is safer. You want to go for the safer approach. Okay, queen c1. interesting. Thinking about queen a4 check, first thing you always look at is a contact move, right? Check, capture, exchange, sacrifice move that goes forward. But then bishop d7, yeah, it's not so clear, yeah? Okay, then. So queen c1 then makes sense, I guess. Although I don't know if it's the best. Actually, maybe it is not the best, because I think black can just, I think black can like just take and play like king d7, let's say, yeah, defend all these ancient squares, and then like play either rook c8 or rook b8, putting pressure here. Like I said, eventually if you play b5, black can play b4, black can play like a5, and I think like black is fine, and we have few pieces to generate some real play for a win, and I think black is fine. So perhaps a better move if you want to play for a win would have been like queen d2 and then like rook c1 and keep the queens on the board. So that's why, see, and the queen on d2 is not like the most active, so that's why I think this, let's say, would have been much better, right? Because now I have a great queen on the greatest square, and then you can play, I don't know, rook c5 or I don't know, stuff like this, right? But the queen would control a lot of like squares and also not allow black's queen to come through these squares. Restrict black's queen. That's why, yeah. But okay, yeah, queen c1, not so sure. But okay, queen b6, like I said, black would have just taken. Queen c3, okay. Rook d1. I mean, the pawn is guarded, so who do you attack? Unless you wanna like control d4, which does make sense. But I think the c file is more important. A piece, the rook on d4 will just look nice, but not do anything. Whereas the rook on c8 can actually like penetrate through c1 or through c2, put pressure on f2, put pressure on b2. So I think in these kind of positions, when there's an open file, you wanna control the open file, not attack a defended pawn. So I think rook c1. But then again, black can just play like rook c8 and simplify, right? Let's say here and just like take and simplify. Yeah, black should be fine. Okay, rook d1, here, queen d4. Yeah, this is very bad. I think black can like just take. And now if rook takes d4, then rook c1 check, bishop f1, bishop h3, game over, it is checkmate. But if ed, it's not good to play ed, because when you block the rook, now you have an isolated pawn. You never want to have a pawn on d4 in these positions. You want to have a piece, because then you keep your neat pawn structure, and then you put pressure on this pawn, and you also have this great outpost, right, for a piece. The pawn doesn't do anything, blocks the rook, it's isolated. Also now, without the pawn on e3, there is potential for black to, now black has pawn majority on the king side, and so there is potential for black to like advance, so black, right, is not good to give him a pawn majority. And also, not even speaking, black can just play rook c2 here, put pressure, have an active rook, and like I said, eventually maybe he can play like this, and simply the rook is very strong and annoying, and if you ever move this rook from here, black can maybe play rook d2, attack the d4 pawn, so black already took over the initiative here, basically. Yeah, huge mistake, should have just played like queen d2, and after, let's say, queen b3, threatening rook c2, you just go like rook c1, and white is fine. Yeah, so you see how basically white completely misplayed this part of the game, completely misplayed. Not taking over the c file, not putting the queen on d4 when they could have, right? Putting pressure on a pawn that is defended, ignoring the c file, not thinking prophylactically, playing queen d4, allowing black to take even after it damaging the pawn structure, allowing rook c2, a bunch of strategical lessons that we can learn from. Let's see, but black played queen b3, I think that's a mistake. I think black should have played simply like this and with initiative. But okay, queen b3 actually still already black should have initiative, so maybe actually it's not that bad, I guess. Oh my god. Okay, yeah, this is obviously a huge mistake. White does not apply prophylactic thinking at all. As you can see, white has problems with back rank, so I guess maybe white should have just played it's like h4 or something, or h3. Let's say h3, yeah? Potentially not to give any bishop g4 stuff. But then black, I think, can just play rook c2. Pressure here. Although, yeah, and now maybe we can just play rook d2. And I've checked king h2. We're probably still worse, but actually it's not so simple for black to win. Because this bishop guards, you know, this key square, and so it's not so easy to checkmate white. Also, this pawn is kind of hanging. This is potentially weak, maybe. So this is still playable, right? It's still playable. Or maybe we can take this pawn, you know, and then somehow guard this pawn with like rook f1 after queen b2. Would also be like a way, let's say something like this, yeah. Also playable, right? Also playable. So I think h3 again. Always make sure you have a window. But okay, let's see, rook d2. Yeah, rook c1. Yeah, bishop f1, bishop h. Yeah, white is completely lost. Alright, I hope you understood the lessons from this game and enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.